welcome everyone to the ACT 2025 side event on how the COP26 package can drive ambition and resilience, most importantly with solidarity and justice. We are broadcasting live from the UN climate negotiations happening right here in Glasgow in the UK. And I'm Wanjira Mathai, Vice President and Regional Director for Africa at the World Resources Institute. And I would like to welcome you to this event. It is absolutely crucial for justice and equity to be spotlighted right here. Three main goals for the ACT 2025 coalition: driving climate ambition, fostering solidarity and prosperity, and also amplifying the voices of the most vulnerable countries. Anchoring this work of ACT 2025 on crucial pillars, 5 crucial pillars: finance, ambition, adaptation, loss and damage, and of course, the rules. With those in mind, we're going to examine the decisions that have been made so far, how we are doing, what the COP package must include to drive ambition and enhance resilience. The truth is that we have and we are in the midst of one of the gravest injustices in human history. And the clock is about to run out. And we have to be honest, and we have to take this to heart and ask ourselves what we need to do and get there fast. In spite of the leadership that climate vulnerable countries continue to show, even those who have exceeded and met their 1.5 degree NDC ambitions, they are still facing dire straits. There are some signs of leadership, and we're going to hear about that, but the power imbalances in the international climate action agenda are clear, and that is exactly why this is an issue of justice. I want to invite our distinguished guests to chime in. I want to introduce them. Ambassador Spencer Thomas. Ambassador Thomas is a special envoy for multilateral environment agreements from Grenada. We have Yared Abera, and Yared is a global youth climate leader from Ethiopia. And we will have climate envoy Tina Stige joining us shortly. And then at the very end, we'll have closing reflections from Yamid Danier from the World Resources Institute. I want to start by thanking the UK government and the UNFCCC Secretariat for hosting and for all the work that goes on behind the scenes that makes this platform possible, especially for those countries and those issues that we care about. This is the one platform where we can focus all our attention on this issue. So we're grateful for all their efforts, and we acknowledge what they're doing behind the scenes. I want to start us off with Ambassador Thomas. We've been talking about this issue at COP for years now. And over the past 10 or so days, delegates from around the world have been convening, and they've assembled around this. To kick us off, I'd really like to hear your thoughts, Ambassador. How is it going? How goes the battle?
Okay, thank you very much, and good day to everyone and to our listeners out there. And thank you for this very difficult question. But first, let me say thanks for the opportunity to be here to respond to some of those issues. I will say that we are going very slowly in the negotiation at the moment. But this is really how the process unfolds at a COP-to-COP situation. We have heard very clearly from the science, and the science is very clear and very loud on what is required for us to get on the path of 1.5. We know very clearly that the indication from the science is that we are at 2.7 degrees, and we are on the wrong side, as someone said, of the 1.5. Our position has always been that we need to be well below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And the trajectory right now is on 2.7. There are some other numbers that are floating around in the negotiations, but albeit all of them on the wrong side. So this is where we are. And I think this COP is going to be measured by the level of ambition that comes out of it. And we are way below that ambition at the moment. We have heard from our world leaders, and they were very clear in terms of where we are going and where we should be going. We heard very strong statements on the issue of coal, on the issue of fossil fuel, on the issue of methane, on the issue of renewable energy, and many of those issues, subsidies for fossil fuel, we heard from our leaders. We are hearing very clearly from the youths of the nation and the global youth voice and advocacy and the need for climate justice. We have seen in the negotiation rooms, of course, a disconnect between what is happening in the youth forum, what is happening in the advocacy forum, what is happening in the side events, what has been said by the leaders. We are seeing a disconnect in the negotiation, whereby the negotiation does not merely recognize some of the things that are happening outside of the negotiation. So I think that's where the disconnect is. But in any event, we are buoyed by the fact that a lot of activities are happening outside of the negotiation, which in fact will be pushing us in the correct direction. So I will say that at this point, we are at a 4.5 level on a scale of 10 in terms of how we are moving in the negotiations at the moment. But this is recognized as the pathway that we usually take at this point in time in negotiations.
Thank you, Ambassador Thomas. Well, 4.5 out of 10, my mother used to say was not so good. And so I want to follow up with another question. What gives you hope in terms of what's going to happen, what's got to happen between now and the end of the week for us to ensure that we are on a pathway to a just outcome, especially for vulnerable countries?
Well, I think we believe that failure is not an option in this COP. We have to leave here with a very ambitious outcome. We have to send the message, and the message from the negotiation must reflect what is happening outside of the negotiation. And as I said, the global community is looking for positive, ambitious action now. We cannot wait on the 2050, 2060, 2070 horizon. We have to act now. The horizon, the science, as I said, has been clear that we need to do ambitious climate action now. So the framework now is 2021 to 2030, not 2060 and 2080 and beyond. Whereas what we do today needs to be consistent with a longer-term horizon. We need to act now. So the point here is that action has to be taken now, and the clear reflection of that action must be the outcome of this COP.
Thank you, Ambassador Thomas. Failure certainly is not an option, and I completely agree. The near-term actions and the credibility, therefore, of those pathways is crucial. I'll come back to you, Ambassador Thomas, but I want to turn to you, Yared. And young people's voices at this COP have been crucially important in keeping the pressure on. What do you see as the necessary next steps for us to secure a just outcome from your perspective?
First, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. It's an honor to sit with you, Wanjira, Ambassador Thomas, and Amit. Young people are really making a good voice globally from the regional perspective, continental as well at the global perspective. They are really making a huge voice, and also they are really protesting on a strike, and also really making, they're trying to make sure that climate changes are really an urgent phenomena which we need to make sure that, or which we make sure to address as urgent as possible. So the first thing what we have to do, or the next step, is to make engaging young people on the means of implementation is very critical. That really address not only just the issue of climate change, but it addresses beyond the climate change, speaking from the vulnerable countries and also developing countries. It also addresses the issue of, unemployment and many things. And also we need to recognize that, the potential of young people, especially in, coming up in an innovative way of addressing this problem. So it's very critical to engage young people as a next step, following this COP26.
A few ministers here already have said that it's crucial that young people's voices continue to put pressure on this process. And I'll come back to you to reflect on some of the specific pillars. But I want to turn to you, Envoy Tina Stege. Thank you for joining us. And Envoy Stege from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. I know that you have been convening and driving the High Ambition Coalition. I really want to hear what you think from that perspective. What are the signs of hope that you see coming out of that coalition?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Hello to all my colleagues and those who are tuning in. I think we had a really great launch of a leaders level statement by the High Ambition Coalition last week that set a bar for what ambition should look like at this COP. And that bar has to include enhanced targets that are aligned with 1.5 and some kind of call or mechanism that brings parties back to the table until we get there, because as we've all said, we're far from where we need to be. That same statement also included, for the first time from this coalition, very sort of specific and concrete actions and policies that governments are committing to. For example, phasing out coal, dealing with fossil fuel subsidies, looking at emissions in the transport sector, including in shipping. So really getting into specifics on the concrete actions that need to be done. It's not just about the promises and the targets, it's also the actions. That statement looked at adaptation and the need for increased ambition on adaptation, and specifically doubling climate finance for adaptation. And then finally, it spoke to the lack of delivery on the 100 billion, the need to deliver on that, but also the need to look at the new finance goal, but based on the real needs of vulnerable countries and based in science. So we're very excited that that vision was able to get out there from a group of countries who, have really widely diverging backgrounds. We have small countries, we have large countries, we have wealthy countries, we have poorer countries. And it's not an easy statement. It's not an easy thing to get folks around a table to agree. And I think that it really was exciting that we were able to do that. It took months and months of discussions and work to get there. And I'm very proud that that statement was put out. Now we need to actually see it translate into the outcomes of the decision. And so there's still quite a bit of work, and I think my colleague has spoken to where we're at. We're not where we need to be, and so we're going to keep pushing.
That's great. Envoy Stege, there were several announcements made last week during the Leaders Summit, and I'm curious to hear, and also the fact that you've made a very good point about the fact that vulnerable countries and the combination of those showing high ambition, it's not just on one side. There seems to be solidarity there. There's a question about solidarity when it comes to issues of centrality for vulnerable countries. But I'm curious about what gave you hope from the announcements that were made last week.
I mean, I think that the announcements that were made last week, obviously the hack statement gave me quite a bit of hope, but there were also very good announcements in other areas, looking specifically again at sort of the concrete measures that need to be taken, whether on methane. But again, these are commitments, and so we really need to see how these translate into actual action. And I think some mechanism of accountability for those commitments is also useful. As I said, I think we had it was a good shot in the arm, those announcements at the beginning. We're seeing a lot of stiff headwinds in the negotiation rooms where those announcements aren't necessarily translating. And I think we just can't let up. And those of us from the vulnerable countries in particular, we really can't let up. And we really need to make sure that in the rooms, folks are living up to the announcements and the commitments that leaders put forward at the beginning of the week. And I just want to recognize those of us who from the outside, in particular our youth, and those of us so we have youth delegates in our delegation. They're a big part of helping make that push as well.
That's great. Ambassador Thomas, I want to come back to you. I received a message this morning from a woman from India who works on adaptation and works with slum communities. And she said to me, we really have to pick up accountability pathways for access to finance to adaptation funds. Even as you champion adaptation finance, how do we hasten access? What would you say to her?
That's a great question in terms of adaptation finance. And this is the crux of the discussion that we have within the negotiation at the moment. The 100 billion that was promised in 2009 in Copenhagen had to do with the context of mitigation at that point in time. And over the years, we have looked at it, and many countries have indicated that, yes, mitigation, but yes, adaptation. We need resources for adaptation. And that is the crux of the matter now. There is the whole question in the negotiation of the balance between finance for adaptation and finance for mitigation. For the vulnerable countries, we see that we need to act on both dimensions of climate change at the same time and with great ambition. Because adaptation is important, because at this point in time where we are in terms of global warming at 1.1, 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we are actually experiencing significant impacts on climate change. So we have to build resilience in the economies. We have to adapt to the current conditions. If we continue on this mitigation pathway and towards the 2.7 as we are now, adaptation becomes even more, because what we're saying here is every degree of warming brings exponential impacts on these countries. So adaptation becomes, again, a very key issue. And herein lies the issue and the link with loss and damage and financing for loss and damage. So the question here is, resources have to be made available for mitigation to ensure that we do not breach the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. That's first. Second, resources must be made available to adapt and to build resilience in the economies of the developing countries, and especially the small island developing states. Of course, Marshall Islands will agree with this. And then we will have to have resources available for addressing the issue of loss and damage. So this, in fact, when we speak about ambition, we are speaking ambition for mitigation. We are speaking ambition for adaptation action. We are speaking for ambition for finance, for adaptation and finance for loss and damage. We are also thinking about ambition in terms of the manner in which, the speed of which, and the urgency of which we take those actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Thomas. Here, there's a lot being said about implementation. And I wonder, from your perspective, the issue of loss and damage to me represents one where it is front and center. It's happening even as we speak here in Glasgow. What does progress on loss and damage look like coming out of this COP?
One good thing I observed, or one mixed feeling I have, is the issue of loss and damage is being, more dominant on the agenda of COP26, which is a good thing. However, sitting on the negotiation room, and seeing the negotiations going on is also a bit frustrating. Of course, the issue of loss and damage with regards to especially on the operationalization of Santiago network is now, being discussed in the negotiation room. However, on the governance issue and also on finance for loss and damage and also finance for operationalization of Santiago network is not yet being, discussed. We are now on this scope, just focusing on the functionality of the loss and damage, because the governance and other issue needs more push from the vulnerable countries, from the developing countries, and also that needs to be more discussed under the COP and CMA agendas. So this is the feeling I am feeling that it's a kind of mixed. So, however, the issue of loss and damage, like coming from Ethiopia also, last year we have been facing floods, droughts, and also even extreme weather events with regards to also locusts. That's really, affecting the food securities and also the issue of also human security to live in that area. So the issue of loss and damage really needs to be addressed in this scope, especially not only just being discussed on the issue of just functionalities or some minor issues, but the issue of finance for loss and damage is very critical to be addressed. And also, if this scope needs to be, successful, and also needs to be, if this COP26 to be to say COP26 is successful, the issue of loss and damage needs to be addressed, addressing not just only on addressing or on just saying that, but with regards to also allocating finance for loss and damage. Here I would like to mention that the Scotland pledged $1 million for the issue of loss and damage. This gives a good hope, and also it gives us some optimism, to work more and also, to address this on loss and damage.
That's really, really helpful to see. Envoy Stiggy, I want to come to you and think about what we want to see, what success looks like coming out of this COP. I was excited about this exercise that was done by the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and they said, what headline would you like to see the morning after COP coming out of here? And if you could give us what your headline would be, and then also why that headline.
I think ambitious package agreed in Glasgow. And reflecting back on what Grenada said, that ambition includes a broad range of topics. It's not just, it must be ambition on mitigation, right? The 1.5 needs to be central. It needs to be our guiding star for the islands in particular, but really for the globe. Beyond 1.5, the science has told us, will be catastrophic. And so we really have to do all that is necessary to safeguard that temperature goal and make sure that it's in reach. It's far out of reach at the moment, and so much must be done to address that gap. We need to have ambition on adaptation. We've talked quite a bit about this. The adaptation financing is just not even close to being enough. And I know for the small island developing states, it's sort of 2% of what is coming through in terms of climate financing. And so that is why we included in that High Ambition Coalition statement a commitment to double adaptation financing. We really need to see that go up. We need ambitious outcomes on finance, both the finance that we're talking about now, which is the 100 billion goal, and which everyone recognizes is inadequate, right? We talk about the trillions that will be needed. So yes, it's the 100 billion, but it's also the longer term goal. And how do we determine what that is? And it has to be based in real needs. It has to be based in the science and what science is telling us what, in terms of what those costs and needs will be. And it also has to address this issue of loss and damage because, and when we're talking about loss and damage, there has to be a recognition that any finance for loss and damage would be new and additional and separate from what is already going towards mitigation and adaptation, because those are separate issues. Those, let me just say on loss and damage, there are going to be things that are incalculable losses. You cannot pay for what will be lost in my country. We are looking at the loss of islands. We're looking at the loss of heritage. We're looking at the loss of access to, I think of one of my islands that have been with us for generations. These can't be paid for, but there can be ways to help us manage that loss and handle that loss. Both in physical terms, but also in emotional and psychological terms. So an ambitious package has to include all of those. I'll also add in the rule book that there needs to be finalization of the discussions on Article 6, but in a way that drives ambition, not in any way that pulls us backward, because we're already far behind. We can't afford a carbon market system that pushes ambition backward in any way. So yes, an ambitious package was agreed in Glasgow, would be the headline that I would hope to see. And then the next day, we all have to do the work to actually implement that ambitious package.
That's really great. Obviously, I want to follow up on one thing you talked about, the incalculable losses. There's a constant drumming of, when the discussion on loss and damage is put on the table, this idea that we need a business case. But there can be no business case, in my mind, when it comes to human life and some of the losses that, what do you say to people who continue to insist on a business case for loss and damage?
I say look at your own country and think about how this is going to affect you. And I do think we're seeing those losses that we've been contemplating and concerned about for many decades now. They're hitting countries all over the world. I just remember the horrible images that I was seeing when the floods happened in Germany, and all those homes that were lost, those businesses that were lost, but even worse, the lives that were lost. You can't pay for those things. But the fact of the matter is that wealthier nations have resources to somehow help their populations cope. And our countries do not. And to make it worse, the crisis was not of our own making. We're trying to cope with a crisis that, one, we didn't make, and two, we have no resources to handle. So this is why there needs to be real solidarity, which is recognizing that we are going to need the support from those countries who do have the resources to cope.
Really well said. I think that the definition of the injustice therein in those words, Envoy Stiggy, thank you so much for that. Ambassador Thomas, your headline and why?
Well, I think the headline should be on that no one is left behind at the conclusion of this climate. I think climate justice should be a key feature of the outcome. At least we must define whatever we come out with under the lens of climate justice. We heard very clearly from the advocacy outside of the room. We heard, as I said, from our leaders. We heard already various non-state actors taking real action on the ground. And I agree with Tina. It's about how we translate what comes out of this into action, decisive climate action now, and that no one should feel that they are left behind from the outcome of this COP. This should be the headline in my view. What is the signal that we send? How do we catalyze action, decisive climate action now, to prevent us from breaching the 1.5 degrees Celsius, to prevent us from getting into the waters that we can't swim? I think that is the issue. How do we shape the future that we want from this climate action? How do we ensure that the youths of tomorrow, that the youths who have actually indicated very clearly where the direction in which we need to go, and that they had absolutely no contribution to the global warming, and yet they are the ones who will be caused to carry the burden. So how does the outcome of this COP signal clearly the actions that needs to be taken to address the issue of climate justice? I think that is a lens in which we need to measure the outcome of this COP. It must be very clearly, as Tina has indicated, ambitious action on all pillars of the negotiation, but it must have a lens of justice.
So well said. Ambassador Thomas, one question to that. Is it an issue of how we are communicating? Because it sounds so compelling when you say it. I'm not in those negotiating rooms. But why is this not landing?
Well, I mean, there are some reasons why we're not landing in the negotiations. It may have to do with geopolitics. It may have to do with domestic inertia on the part of some countries. They're looking at the domestic political situation. And I think that is where the problem is. I think we are past the issue of climate denial. We have generally agreed that the science is incontestable. We have generally agreed with the pathway towards the 1.5. But the question is, how do we get the geopolitics and the national domestic inertia to move in the direction of getting us to the path that secures a future for all of us?
Well said. And sometimes I think our youth voices are exactly what we need to unlock that inertia. And we are agreed on the general direction of travel. We are agreed on all the fundamentals here. What are your headlines and why?
One of the headlines I really would like to see is Glasgow set a great ambition for action and support. So when we say action, it's really critical to view it developed countries to take action on their responsibility, as well as to put ambition in support of the developing countries. This is one of the headlines I really would like to see. The second one is on finance. Glasgow, the Glasgow declare finance for climate change, or it might be Glasgow declare action and finance for global goal on adaptation. Finance for adaptation is a critical one. That's another headline I really would like to see. Third one also, Glasgow declares, first Glasgow recognize loss and damage and allocate finance for loss and damage. These three things are really critical, and also I really would like to see on the next day of COP26. And this is what I urge to world leaders and also countries to agree on these points, and also really bring us, some good news to the world, to the people, especially for vulnerable countries. These are my headlines, and also as we are seeing like this, engagement of young people also is very critical. Engaging young people in each and every sector, especially on means of implementations, this panel is a good example. At least there is one young people in this panel, being engaged. So I want to see many young people, taking action on the ground, from just taking, just striking on the street, and also translated to an action on the ground.
Thank you, Yared. In her opening remarks, Elizabeth Wathuti asked the leaders to open their hearts, and sometimes you think it becomes such an intellectual discussion that we forget what we're dealing with are human lives and real everyday challenges. I want to ask you, Yared, just to follow up on that. It seems like Scotland opened up their hearts. I heard that loss and damage has received some momentum from the government of Scotland. What were your thoughts on that? Is that the beginning of good progress?
Of course, that a bit give us, I'm saying a bit give us some optimism. However, much more needed, much more work needed, in addressing the loss and damage. My sister Tina already mentioned good points with regards to loss and damage, which needs to be addressed, which with regards to non-economic losses, which we can't get a recovery or get compensation on that. However, this issue also needs to be considered while discussing the loss and damage. The non-economic issues or losses are very, I don't know how we can do that assessment, or but this needs to be recognized also, and also very critical. Other than that, with regards to addressing this, need assessment is very critical to do. The need assessment, while which country faces extreme weather events, and also how we can assess that is really critical. With regards to support, the need assessment is very critical, and that really needs to be worked out and also needs to be discussed in this scope, especially starting this scope of, I know we have a limitation of time. However, the discussion needs to be started and also needs to be addressed as early as possible. The urgency I'm seeing in the streets needs to come to in the table as well, or in the negotiation rooms. The urgency really matters. We need to understand the climate urgency very well. That's I really would like to see, especially from world leaders, not just only pledging with regards to net zero, but addressing with regards to action and support is very critical.
Great, Yared. Yesterday, in a program we were on, someone made a really fantastic call, said Article 6 is not yet fixed. And that's really crucial. I want to invite Yamid Danye from WRI to give her reflections on what she's heard, and maybe also a reflection on Article 6. It's not yet fixed, I heard.
No, there's, as Ambassador Thomas said earlier, there's still a lot. We're still 4.5 out of 10 in the negotiation, which is expected at this stage. But still, I think what I heard is that I heard the word hope, coming in this table, despite the challenges, despite being at this 4.5 out of 10, in terms of progress. Good talk. Good commitments last week, but still a disconnect, between the urgency that we see in the street, from our youth, from the reality that was well described, by, our ambassadors from the Marshall Islands, from Grenada, so real stories that we heard. And we need to translate that into the text somehow. And for that, accountability matters. Accountability to keep 1.5 alive, accountability to adapt. We're still discussing how to get, the right level of predictability, but also tracking for our vulnerability on the global goal on adaptation. It's been so much behind And I think we heard Ambassador Thomas said, leaving no one behind and no issues behind actually for this COP as a headline. And this is particularly the case for adaptation and loss and damage. And we need to make sure that we've got the means, the evidence, the tools to track, to assess our efforts, and to support and scale up, those efforts. And what is interesting is that we don't need to choose between adaptation or loss and damage in the support. I think, we heard from the ambassadors, it's not, we need new additional, we need both because we're facing those existential threats, as we speak. So, solidarity, therefore, is important. And we heard solidarity at scale, solidarity in terms of access, solidarity in terms of the quality as well, because we need this funding, not to add to the debt that, vulnerable countries are facing already. Therefore, more grants rather than loans, will make a difference, and that needs to be also, achieved in addition to the scale to reach, almost this parity between adaptation and mitigation. So I think we heard how frustrating still the negotiations are on adaptation and loss and damage. Yesterday was the Adaptation and Loss and Damage Day. Scotland made a symbolic gesture, an unprecedented one, but it's a drop in the ocean still. And the question is, who is next? We need to see, therefore, more concrete decisions, not just a recognition that this issue is there. That recognition was laid out in Article 8 of the Paris Agreement. There's a full article already. We need to go beyond and go into the implementation, and therefore, what we heard, from our panelists is that, we need to have decisions that convey specific space, specific processes, to identify where that finance could come from, how this finance can be channeled to really help, not pay. And I think that was very compelling. We cannot pay for the loss of an island. We cannot pay for the loss of an heritage, but at least help, manage those losses. And, we need to have, therefore, those mechanisms and those finances in place, and the decisions needs to reflect that. I think we heard ambition, 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 ambition for mitigation, ambition for adaptation, ambition for support, ambition for loss and damage. And we heard implementation, implementation, implementation. It's not about we moved out of treaty design. We need to get those rules adopted to really get into this implementation mode, and with heart, solidarity, and accountability. And for the accountability, you get me now to Article 6. I think there's a whole set of rules being discussed as we speak, and it's very important to make sure that those rules are as robust. Because what we heard today was that, getting that window to just keep 1.5 alive is shrinking. That window cannot be undermined further by, loopholes and weak rules. Therefore, it's very important that whatever market mechanisms that we adopt, the rules that we adopt, there's no double counting. They cannot be fake. Again, they cannot make any of our efforts fake. They need to make them real. So making sure that on Article 6, there's no double counting. It's not just a trading exercise. It needs to really deliver additional ambition. It needs to maintain environmental integrity. It needs to preserve human rights. We heard over the past few days that even the notion of human rights have been, put into jeopardy, and that's not acceptable. And we need to make sure that it also supports the solidarity that we heard, with this share of proceeds, the levy, to be set up in a way that really support the predictability and scale up of funding that we need to see on adaptation. And this needs to be supported by a strong transparency framework. It's interesting that even on transparency, there's bickering as to whether we need to be transparent on the support of even loss and damage. We're lagging behind. We should not be discussing about this. So let's stop false competitions. It's not choosing one or the others. We would like to make sure we don't fall into the zero-sum game, and that truly, from a climate justice point of view, we leave no one behind. And we see, and to do that, we may need to see all negotiators looking at things also from a child lens, from a youth lens, with the same enthusiasm and energy that we see in the street.
Yamid, thank you very much. And sadly, we're running out of time, but what a wonderful session this has been to shine a spotlight on, quite frankly, what is the most important subject. I heard hope, ambition, solidarity. I really hope that that becomes a permanent part of what we do. COVID-19 was such a humbling and continues to be such a humbling time for all of us. It's a personal thing too, because we send our children to school, many, or children in your care, every day masked. Nothing is more gut-wrenching than to see those children put on their masks and go to school. They are facing a very unstable world, and a world that is challenging, dangerous. But for Black and brown children around the world, it's more unstable still. It's unjust that they would face a more unstable future because they belong to places where they're more vulnerable. Those countries are more vulnerable. Sitting here in Glasgow could sometimes seem like a bit of a luxury, an academic exercise, when we take those little faces out of our sight. So the flooding, the heat waves, what we face in light of the losses and damages because of this crisis, these are real. We owe it to ourselves as adults to show up, and to show up better, because we are better than this. We really are. And quite frankly, history will judge us quite harshly if we don't. Thank you so much to our panelists, Envoy Stegi, Ambassador Thomas, Yared, Yamid. It has been an honor. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.